Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining the Australia 4.0 debate series operating under the sponsorship of the Pearcey Foundation. The Pearcey Foundation acknowledges the Ngunnawal people and all the traditional custodians who belong to the lands where the Pearcey Foundation and you, our guests, meet, live, and work. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today and their elders past and present, whose stories, traditions, and living cultures in this country are a valuable resource, as are those of all who have come to make Australia their home. Together, we are Australia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the third event in the Australia 4.0 debate series. My name is Ian Opperman. I'm the chair of the Australia 4 activity. This series of debates we are about to take the next step in is the culmination of more than 4 years of effort exploring the issues of the transition to net zero in the energy sector through the lens of data, digital, and ICT. Australia needs a consistent approach to get to net zero, as the current debate is fractured, especially in the use of digital technology in our infrastructure. Working with partners such as Standards Australia, Engineers Australia, the Australian Computer Society, the CSIRO, universities, regulators, and consumer representatives, Australia 4 has tried to create a constructive space for this important dialogue. The goal of Australia 4 has been to identify a set of commonly agreed challenges and propose ways to address them from a digital and data perspective. The summary of the first phase, which covered 2023 to 2024, was released in a communique in May 2024, which you can find on the Pearcey website. Since then, since the middle of 2024 and during the course of this year, what we've done is continued with workshops held in conjunction with partners who care deeply about the transition to net zero, where we've addressed issues related to putting the consumer at the heart of the future grid, digitization of that future grid, digital skills needed for future workforce, and the standards, which is the focus of our conversation today. But in all of these cases, in all of these workshops, we've sought to focus discussions around the lens of what is the role of ICT, and what are the opportunities for innovation, and of course, what's the benefit to Australia and Australian consumers. Today, this is the third in the series of 5 debates addressing these key issues identified during those workshops. These debates are run each Friday. Thank you for coming today, and will not only take place today, but for the next 2 weeks as we finish out the series. Please do note that there is a Slido QR code where you can participate online and ask questions of our debaters. Now, for those of you who know that I really genuinely love standards. I think they're an incredibly important part of not only the electrotechnical challenges that we face, but many of the ways that we create safe environments to operate, and absolutely no less so in the debate around transition to net zero. I'm delighted, therefore, that we're having this conversation, and I'm really glad we're talking about the big question of standards underpin our national success. And today's debate will be moderated by George Sfinas, who's the engagement manager at Standards Australia. And we have an excellent group of debaters. So as mentioned, today's debate is the third in the series of 5. Please come along to the next 2. And we ask the question, Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future, pro and con. And as mentioned, moderated by George Sfinas. So George, without further ado, I'll pass to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that. This does shape to be a very exciting and interesting, thought-provoking debate. Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future. So, as Ian has mentioned, we stand at the crossroads of a global energy transformation, and Australia is in a unique position as well. We lead the world in things like rooftop solar penetration. We're innovating in consumer energy resources. And importantly, we're actively contributing to international standards bodies. In fact, one thing you'll probably hear quite often today is that we often punch above our weight in the international standards arena. But the question does remain, should we continue to adapt and adopt these standards from international bodies and even from global powers like China, Europe, and the US? Or should we take the reins ourselves and define our own sovereign standards that reflect our distinct energy landscape, our policy ambitions, and our innovation potential? So today's debate will look at this critical issue from a number of different angles: the strategic importance of standards, the benefits and risks of international alignment, and the dynamic between standards and policy, and who should lead on that. So with that, I'll dive in and introduce our speakers. We've got Ed Chan, who is the head of energy advisory for Mott MacDonald. We've got Lucy Finlay, a standardization and regulation manager, Pacific Zone for Schneider Electric. Carlita Warren, our head of engagement at Standards Australia, and Stuart Powell, head of standards and industry engagement at Switched In. Before we get into the debate itself, I thought I should also highlight that, and I think Jordan has kindly put the link on the chat as to how to get into the Slido. Slido is where we will be taking our Q&A, but importantly, it's also where we'll be asking the important questions. So I think the question we've got ourselves today, I think we'll start the debate with asking the big question: Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future? I will ask that you please scan your phones over the QR code. You will be taken to a poll. You can cast your vote. So Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future. Agree or disagree? We'll just have a bit of time for this. Will be interesting to see the way how this goes. Okay, are we ready to release the poll debates, or the poll outcome, rather?
Let's just give it a chance. We've only got about
Yep.
2/3 of the people voting, so let's see if we can get a few more people to vote.
Okay, very interesting. So we're going into this debate thinking that we should define our own standards to shape our energy future. Very interesting. Thank you for that. So I think we can get straight into the debate. So with that, I would like to invite Ed Chan, Head of Energy Advisory at Mott MacDonald, who's on the affirmative side that we should set our own sovereign standards to shape our energy future. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, George. Hello, everyone. For those of you who I haven't met, I haven't always been a consultant. I've spent a fair bit of time in the energy regulation space, primarily at the national level, both at the Australian Energy Market Commission, Energy Security Board, and a variety of things. For today's topic, I agree with Ian that sovereign standards, it's important. It's very important for the energy transition and consumer energy resource integration. But it is not you got to remember that this is really right at the end of the journey. The reason why we need sovereign standard goes all the way back to policy setting at the national level. We are unique in Australia. Having spoken to many other overseas players, everyone think that they are unique, but we are particularly unique in a number of ways. Our federation structure means that the federal government actually doesn't have a clearly defined role, not until very recently, on government policy energy. Energy is a matter of the states. And when you look at the number of states we have at any one point in time, you may have different political party being in power or not. That's one aspect of the uniqueness. The other aspect of the uniqueness is we've got a country, we've got a landscape and climate that is very different to any other places. And this is why we've got the level of CER uptake that we have. No other country in this earth has the abundance particularly in solar resources, when it comes to consumer energy resources, and no other country has taken that up as uniquely and as enthusiastically as we have. So when you combine all of that together, very enthusiastic consumers, somewhat detached government sometimes, but then that void's filled by state government. So when you have all of that, you would very easily see a variety of different standards coming up. And we've seen in the past, certain state governments who are ahead of the time would say, why don't we just adopt an overseas standard? That's something that we can grab. It's easy. We can adapt it. Quite often, that adaptation ends up being its own almost unique standard. So yeah, the CCPOS, it's based in IEEE 2030.5. It's meant to be an adopted standard, but we have made so much changes now that it's almost its own thing, to a point where I think Standards Australia would be looking at publishing its own standards. So all of that is just background context information. But what's most important is we're talking about consumer energy resources, and the key word there is consumer. Whatever we do in this space, whatever we need to come up with needs to meet the consumer needs. And I would argue that our consumer needs is different to other countries' consumer needs. So for those of you who've been involved in the industry before, we've got this significant opportunity in solar generation during the day, the duck curve. It's very reflective of our climate condition. National policy now, and both at state and national level, I must say, are all about driving a better consumer outcome. All of that leads to the need for a sovereign standard that is there to help meet our needs, our consumers' needs. And yes, you can't say that it's the only thing that we can do, should do. Where appropriate, perhaps we should consider adopting international standards. But by and large, my view is, to meet our consumers' need, we actually need to do what's right for our consumers. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Ed. So going to the negative side, I'd like to invite Carletta Warren from Standards Australia to present the case.
Perfect. Thanks, George, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm actually going to share my screen, if nothing else, to keep myself on track, and just to give you a little bit of information that will be peppered through my side of the argument today. Hopefully those slides have now come up. If someone can just give me the thumbs up. Has that all worked?
Perfect.
Perfect. So just in preparing for today, and obviously having conversations with my counterpart on the con side of the debate, I did get flashbacks to year 10 debating, and I don't know whether or not there's an element of PTSD associated with that. So do bear with me as I go through my presentation today. But I am presenting on the side of con. So my side actually strongly supports that adopting established international standards is essential for interoperability, cost efficiency, and rapid deployment of consumer grid technologies. In a fast evolving energy landscape with distributed generation, smart inverters, electric vehicles, aligning with global standards isn't actually optional, it's a strategic choice. And our case will be based on three key arguments. International standards connect Australia to...
Carletta, sorry to interrupt. You're sharing your PowerPoint edit mode, not presentation screen.
Let me see. Has that come up now?
No, you'll cancel the share and then reshare the running PowerPoint, the slideshow, not the edit.
This works.
Wait, you've brought us back to the edit window.
We might just have to, I'm not too sure what's...
Well, then you'll just have to advance the slides because we weren't seeing, you were obviously talking to the next slide, but we were only seeing the first slide.
Oh, that's okay. I'll shortly move it. So, okay, so our case will be based on 3 key arguments. International standards connect Australia to a global economy. They let us draw on proven international experience, avoiding costly mistakes, and they give Australia a platform to lead and influence global best practice. So if we start with international standards driving global connection, adopting international standards links Australia to a global network of proven technologies and expertise. It builds consumer and industry trust through consistent and safety and performance, and it strengthens trade. So some key examples that we found, a major study of 6 Northern European countries found that standardization accounted for around 9% of total export growth between 1995 and 2019. But don't take my word for it. There are countless examples where standardization has benefits for global economies and productivity. Even Australia's own Productivity Commission found that alignment with international overseas standards could raise GDP by 0.2%, which equates to around $1.9 billion. The other thing that we need to be mindful of, for a small open economy like Australia, less than 2% of global GDP, we account for less than 2% of global GDP. Aligning with global standards is actually vital. When our standards are highly specific to Australia, it discourages global manufacturers from supplying our market because producing compliant products for a small market holds significant cost. This means fewer products, less choice, and slower innovation. The other point that I think we need to make is with regards to some of our commitments. So as a signatory to the WTO TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade, we are required to use international standards as the basis for regulation where possible. Even Standards Australia's own MOU with the Australian government reinforces that we utilise international standards to the maximum extent possible. This ensures our markets stay open, competitive, and globally aligned. Now, if we start looking at learning from the global experience, if we take AS 5385, the Smart Energy Profile Protocol, this Australian standard adopts the US IEEE 2030.5 communication protocol, which allows devices from different manufacturers to speak the same language. But let's talk about the benefits of that. It cuts network costs, it supports dynamic operating envelopes, it future-proofs and aligns globally, and it also speeds up deployment. So by building on international expertise, Australia avoids duplicating effort, reduces integration risk, and speeds up the rollout of smart energy systems, which is exactly what this debate today is about. So if I move on to my third and last point, which is where we lead, the world follows. And I think we've had a conversation about this earlier. Australia is not just an adopter, we're also a contributor in the international space. So through Standards Australia's participation at ISO and IEC, we help shape global rules. And a perfect example of this is ASNZS 4777.1 and Part 2 on grid connection of solar and battery inverters, which have positioned Australia as a world leader in distributed energy resource standards. This leadership ensures safe and reliable integration while informing international best practice. By aligning with international frameworks, Australia's innovation scales globally, reducing costs for local firms and opening export opportunities. So in closing, adopting international standards is a strategic choice. It connects Australia to global expertise, accelerates clean energy innovation, and where we learn, we advance faster. Where we lead, we shape the future. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Carlita. So our second speaker now for the affirmative side, Stuart Power from Switched In. Stuart, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm really looking forward to convincing you over the next few minutes, those 23% who are in the know, case to change your mind and move over to the yes case in the next few minutes. But before I get into it, let me give you a bit of background. I've been involved for my whole career in delivering solutions, leading teams of people or participating in teams of people that work in technology in a rapidly changing environment, in computer technology, software development, in telco in particular, where we saw rapid change, and in the internet. And it's in that sort of fast changing environment that I've had to work and operate with my colleagues, and standards play a really important part of that. It's absolutely vital that we have standards that work and that allow people to cooperate and allow people to make things happen and deliver solutions at pace in that rapidly changing environment. The thing about that, though, is that the knowledge that has to go into all those standards to make it work isn't fixed. There's many unknowns in that rapidly changing environment, and if you want to innovate at pace, and if you want to get everybody cooperating and delivering proper solutions, then you need to understand how much you don't know. It's not like there's some expert group sitting somewhere that knows all the answers to everything that you need to standardize. You're always operating in an environment where that knowledge gap exists. So what I'd like to do is just cover 3 different areas where I think there's particular knowledge gaps in the energy transition, where we're trying to develop solutions in a rapidly changing environment, and why national solutions, national standards are the important bit of that. There's case 1 where Australia knows best about what's going on. Case 2 is nobody knows best what's going on. And the third case is somebody else, others know best about what's going on. I want to cover each of those in turn and talk about why it's important for us to develop national standards. The first case is, where does Australia know best? So how do we fill the knowledge? How do we deal with the knowledge gap where Australia is leading the world, and how do we incorporate the knowledge that we get from that leadership in the world into the standards that we create? And that's certainly the case, as we've been talking about, in solar. Solar PV has got great penetration in Australia, and we've learned a lot from that experience. That means that we're ahead in the world. We've got bigger penetration. We know more about scale. We know more about how all the CER devices, solar systems, solar inverters connect into the network, and we're getting the experience that you really need in order to build those standards correctly. Other jurisdictions have hundreds of connections of inverters into their systems. Typically, we have thousands, and it's just growing every day. It's quite likely that we're experiencing that in batteries as well. So with the Cheaper Home Batteries program, this is going to accelerate as well. So what do we do in that case? We need to really determine our own standards, and we do. We might take the international 2030.5 standard, which is what we've done for that, but we need to develop an Australian version of that, which we call C4NET EPS, that deals with the sort of scale and the sort of problems that we're getting, that we're leading the world in. And that's what we've done. You could argue that we haven't done it well enough at the national level, because we've had too many jurisdictions interpreting even the C4NET EPS standard in different ways, and that's caused a lot of problems for manufacturers who are trying to connect into all those jurisdictions. We should have done it better. We should have been more nationally compliant. The national level is the right way to do that. And if there's any mistakes there, it's not that we didn't follow international standards, it's because we didn't do it well enough nationally. There's 4 of us from Australia who sit on the CSIP committee, the International IEEE committee that is looking at how to do the next version of CSIP. They really value our experience. When we talk about what's really happening in Australia, they always listen to us, which is fantastic. So knowledge area 1 is where Australia is leading the world. The second one was, where are the areas where no one knows best? Where's the area where nobody really understands how to connect all this stuff together? There's many of those, many unknowns. A couple of examples. One is, how would we have cooperating devices in virtual power plants or other devices behind the meter or in front of the meter cooperating together in order to deliver the best outcome for consumers? A second one would be, how do we use pricing signals in order to drive the right behaviour in this environment? Nobody knows the answers to that. everybody's guessing as to what to do. So how do you cope with creating standards that will allow people to cooperate? One of the things that's happened in other places is the value of de facto standards, or some people call them soft standards, is really important in that case. Nobody really knows what's happening, but you don't want everybody to go and run off and do their own thing, create their own standards. So what tends to happen is you get de facto standards that people will buy into. Somebody will have an idea and they'll create a de facto standard that people will adopt, and people will try it out, and then they'll evolve, and eventually you'll come along and work out, how do we really want to standardize this and make it a fully firm technical compliant standard? You'll use the experience from those soft standards or those de facto standards to incorporate those into the proper standards. And that's where we need to play a game. We need to play that at the national level as well. If you, again, let every jurisdiction go off and do their own thing, you'll have too much variety. It's too hard for people to cooperate together, both the manufacturers and the networks. And you don't learn enough consistently about how to evolve those standards. So again, doing something at the national level, trying it out, giving it a go, and using that experience to feed into the formal standards is the proven and workable approach. Again, doing that at the national level rather than some smaller level or larger level is the thing that works. The third area is where others know best. And in our case, in the energy transition, EV charging would be an example. There's much more experience in Europe and other places with EV charging, and how you incorporate that into the grid is something where we're following behind. So we're thinking of that at the national level. The question still arises, what should we do about adoption of those standards in Australia? And the thing that happens in this evolving marketplace is there's lots of different examples of how that works. Different EV charging, different versions of standards exist. Again, you need some consistency. That says when we bring them into Australia, when we're setting up the networks to cope with those, which standards, which versions do we apply? And again, a practical and sensible example is to a sensible level to coordinate all those things at the national level. You get a degree of cooperation and a degree of opening, a degree of flexibility, but some certainty about how everybody's going to play together. So in all those three areas, whether Australia leads the world, where no one knows what's going on, or where you're adopting expertise from other places, having standards that work at the national level is a really practical and sensible way to evolve in the uncertainty of this environment where things are still moving and changing. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Much food for thought. We'll go to our final debater, Lucy Finlay from Schneider Electric. Lucy.
Thanks, George. And just as an opening point, I'm very glad that Stuart has spoken about the need for national coordination of standards, which is somewhat opposite to the state-focused approach that his counterpart Ed was speaking about with regards to the history of regulation and standards, particularly in the electrical sector in Australia. But to go back to the question at hand, Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future. Well, as Carlita mentioned, we don't necessarily agree with that. When we're talking about defining standards, we're talking about defining technical requirements. Technical requirements are best informed by expertise with the following characteristics: when they are derived from a diverse group of experts, when they incorporate the views of all relevant stakeholders, when they reflect broad agreement, when they serve the common good, and when they are inclusive and comprehensive. We are trying to solve a global issue that requires cooperation and collaboration. We cannot do it alone. And yes, we are a federation of states. In the electrical sector, this state-based regulation has historically and continues today to deliver subpar outcomes for Australia's consumers. Just as on a state level, on a national level, we are not in this alone. Australia can and should set its ambition for change. It must set the strategic direction. It must set the policy. Having set that ambition, it must engage the best and brightest minds from industry at large to get us there in the development of those technical requirements. To do this, we must be deeply connected on the international stage. I spend my entire professional life connecting locally and internationally across the entire industry in the development of standards, many of them critical for the energy transition, whether that be from some of the protocols that have been mentioned today, through to electrical installation standards, through to the standards for the products that are critical, that connect those protocols to the installation, the very products that each of the consumers interact with every single day. Australia is a world leader in the uptake of PV solar, with more than 3 in 10 homes with PV solar these days, and that size of PV connection panels continuing to increase every day. Whilst at the same time, we are a laggard in the uptake of electric vehicles. Where we are leaders, we have not just an opportunity, but a responsibility to share our hard-earned learnings. And that has happened just this week in Standards Australia in Bridge Street, where we have hosted a TC82 meeting of the IEC that is responsible for the development of exactly these standards. Where we are laggards, we must lean into the learning of countries that are leading. And a critical area, as I spoke about, is electric vehicles. Just this morning, I have been leading a group within a committee that we call EL1 that is responsible for the wiring rules, where we have been considering the latest international developments from BS 7671 in the UK through to IEC 60364-7-722 from the IEC, which does provide the international installation requirements for electric vehicles. It is about bringing those people together and learning from those developments. International standards aim to ensure the safety and quality of products, installations and services around the world, and they make a valuable contribution to international trade. Where there is a genuine need for national differences, and I highlight the term differences, due to climatic conditions or safety requirements, we contribute to the assessment and development of these modifications. We support the maintaining of existing local standardisation capabilities to ensure that local industry can continue to make these important contributions. If Australia is to benefit from international standards, Australia must increase its active participation in international standardisation, particularly in fields relating to the energy transition. The electrical product sector does rely on both locally developed standards and adoptions of international standards. Electrical installation standards such as ASNZS 3000, or colloquially known as the wiring rules, and ASNZS 4777.1 for grid-tied inverters are examples of locally developed standards by local technical experts, however, based on latest international developments and local requirements. Electrical product standards, such as ASNZS 61009.1, which is responsible for residual current operated circuit breakers with integral overcurrent protection, or otherwise known as RCDs, the things that prevent us, the very important consumers, from electric shock, and ASNZS 61439 low voltage switchgear and control gear assemblies are examples of international standards that have been adopted with modifications to suit our environment. The key point here is that the work has been completed by local technical experts based on latest international standards and local requirements. We are all in this together, and we must make sure that we do bring that diverse group of experts, that we incorporate the views of all relevant stakeholders, that they reflect broad agreement, that they serve the common good, and that they are inclusive and comprehensive. Australia is unique in many ways, but we share far more in common on this energy transition with the rest of the world than the unique elements of our own story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That was a great way to finish the debate in earnest. I guess now we've got time for rebuttals. So I will ask the affirmative team, Ed and Stuart, to I guess coordinate on a rebuttal to the negative side.
Thank you, George. Stuart, I might start first and then throw over to you. There are both the affirmative and the other side share a few things in common, and I want to just upfront agree on a few things. National approach to standards, national approach to policy in terms of renewable energy, in terms of CA integration, we agree with that. We're not debating that. This is also not about us closing ourselves from the rest of the world. We also agree that we are in this together with all other, the rest of the world, other countries. We're in this together. We know that renewable energy, whether it be grid scale or even at the consumer level, it's a key way of reducing emissions. I also agree with Lucy, and we acknowledge that we are very much connected to the world, through trade, through immigration. A lot of what we do, we are not. We may be an island, but we're not certainly our own. But let's not confuse the need to have sovereign standards from locking ourselves away from the world. This is not what we're arguing. Sovereign standards mean that we are developing something that is suitable to us. That doesn't mean that we don't take advantage of learnings from elsewhere. It doesn't mean that we don't look to others. In fact, we can have a world where we have standards that suit our needs, deliver the consumer outcomes that we want for the Australian unique landscape, but draw heavily upon overseas expertise and skills that have been developed there. The key thing about sovereign standards is developing something that suits us. Having worked in the regulation space for many years, we have, as a country, a habit of adopting overseas frameworks. In the space that I'm most familiar with, economic regulation, we have imported holus bolus from the UK. Their framework, we adopted them, we apply them like it is the gospel. I'll leave you to consider whether that is indeed delivering the right outcome for consumers. The ardent sort of adherence to just dragging things from overseas and not making changes doesn't always work for us. We have similar debate now about should we learn from the US or just bring the framework. It's exactly the same argument. There's nothing wrong with learning and taking the experience from overseas, but let's not go down the trap of whatever's been developed overseas works, because it works overseas. They have their own needs, they have their own situation. What we should do is to develop something that suits us, and that's what I think sovereign standards mean. It doesn't mean locking us away. Sure.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for holding up our end. And I'd like to add to that, the thing that really stands out to me is that we need to innovate at speed. And if you wait for international standards to emerge in a way in some magic form where everybody contributes from around the world, it's not going to be fast enough for the energy transition that we need. That's not how it works. You could say it'd be like everybody going and doing their own thing, and suddenly somehow you get all the experts together and they all agree. The way the experts actually get together is that they tend to gather together in national clusters to go, this is our experience and of what's happening here. And the easiest way to do that is actually in areas where you lead to develop national standards. It's exactly what's happening with CCPOS and incorporating solar inverters into the grid. You're gathering together. You want consistency at a national level. It's all as a stepping stone to getting to that international standard. And if you don't have that national standard along the way, it means that process is slower, more difficult for the people that want to sell it, the suppliers that want to supply into that market, and it doesn't contribute that experience, that gathered experience that we've got at the national level into the international standards. So it's really important that you have something in that space and don't leave a vacuum at the national level just expecting the rest of the world will deliver all this stuff to us. That's not the way innovation happens at speed. It's not the way that standards get developed that are practical and workable. We can't just sit and wait around for that to happen on these areas that are rapidly moving. The other interesting point that was made by the other team is that we're a small market, and that's true. There's a couple of implications about that. One is that when you talk to the suppliers into our market for all this consumer energy resources, what they want is consistency, particularly at the national level. They realise that Australia is going to be a bit different. They want to supply to it. They want to supply into it. They realise it's small compared to other markets, although in some areas where we're still leading the way. What they would really like is to have consistency within Australia as to what they should be delivering. And in areas, again, where we're leading, they're going to use that experience and what they learn here in order to sell their products into other markets. So they're really looking to us to lead the way on standardization. And similarly, in areas where we are following, like EVs, that like consistency that says we want to be able to use the experience that we've got overseas in the standards that work. Which ones are you going to apply in Australia that will allow us to easily sell into that market? So again, because there is in fact a lot of choice about which standards are working in some of these areas, even EV charging, Australia should be picking the ones that we think are best from the international menu of options in order to give suppliers easy access, ready access, cheaper access into supplying Australia with the technology that we need. So think about speed, think about our role in the international market, both leading and following. For those national standards and consistency at the national level is absolutely important.
Thank you, team. Affirmative. I'll now defer to Carletta and Lucy for the negative rebuttal.
Thanks, George. Do you want to start, Carletta, and I'll wrap up again?
Perfect. I think in terms of the debate, and find it fascinating, and there are a lot of nuances, I think, between both sides of the argument. I think coming back to the question at hand, when I think it comes down to the definition of a sovereign standard, to us, a sovereign standard would mean that there is no application or no view into the international world as what may be applicable. But we know that a lot of the standards that are developed today draw from the international market, but potentially look at what needs to be changed, modified, adopted in certain respects so that it is fit for purpose here in Australia. But I think we need to go back to the core area that we do not want to shut ourselves off from the rest of the world by not looking internationally and seeing whether or not there is knowledge, expertise in that sector that can actually benefit us here in Australia. And I think if we look at how we operate as an organisation, to bring an example to you, it is part of our remit that we must look internationally to determine whether or not there is an appropriate level of standards overseas prior to development here. And this goes back to the WTO TBT and a lot of the structures that set us up in terms of how we operate as an organisation. I think it's also important to note that level of industry knowledge and expertise in determining whether or not international standards are appropriate or an Australian standard is more appropriate is looking at making sure that we do and we have an appropriate amount of stakeholder consultation from either side of the fence to determine what is most appropriate here in Australia. And I think Lucy outlined that in her opening remarks, that it is based on technical expertise, that sharing of knowledge and the consensus that happens in those groups formally when we're looking at which standards are most appropriate here for the Australian market. So Lucy, I might throw to you.
Thanks, Carlita. And I'm glad you finished touching on that term consensus, because the principle of local and international standards development is largely about developing consensus. And I was actually very happy to hear from Ed in his opening response to the rebuttal of where we agree. It sounds like those on the other side of the table, for the best part, agree with everything that we have put forward. I would consider that a wonderful development in achieving consensus. And if we can achieve consensus in a debate such as this, I am very confident that by bringing diverse groups of experts and all relevant stakeholders together, that we will continue to develop that consensus by leaning into that international work. I also agree that we do need to innovate at speed. We're doing that now. As I shared this week, we've been hosting international experts in the world of PV solar in Sydney. Next week, I'm hosting a meeting of international experts in the world of circuit protection. Just this morning, as I highlighted before, I was bringing together local experts in defining our new rules with regards to electric vehicles for installation standards. When I moved into this role 4 years ago, I knew that the next decade would most certainly be the busiest decade of my entire life. And we are most certainly not sitting around and waiting for the international world to solve our problems. We are feet first in this together with all of our local connections, with all of the stakeholders around Australia, and particularly our neighbours, New Zealand, and the broader world, in moving as fast as we possibly can to deliver these standards, the technical requirements that will enable all Australians to equitably participate, to equitably receive the benefits that will come from the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, Carlita, and thank you all debaters for what was a really thought-provoking debate. So much so that our Q&A has filled up. So I think I can open the floor to questions. I do note that all questions will be asked, and it will be asked to our debaters on from Slido. So if you haven't already put questions on the Slido, please do. Jordan's put the link in the chat. And fair warning to all our debaters, I will have the questions that will be open to you all, and just feel free to answer as you see fit. So the first question is from Lisa Schutz. Is there an export opportunity for our standards, and could we give our local energy ecosystem companies an advantage to go global? Is there a once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally capitalize on our tech brilliance and earn export dollars for it? And a follow-up reply from Tim Ryan, where with the caveat of more about the products and services that are developed to standards, not just the standards document itself.
I'll give that a go. Yes, absolutely. Is there an opportunity? There is. There's particularly in software and services. I think there's a great opportunity for us to take hold of the learnings that we have. Probably not so much on the hardware, but maybe I'm missing something. But I think in terms of software and services and knowledge opportunity, yes, there are places where we lead the world, and think not just about PV solar and batteries, where we're clearly ahead, but how you integrate those into systems, virtual power plants and other things, because that integration, even how you incorporate an EV into that mix, is an area where we again will be leading the world because of the solar and batteries. So stuff like Amber and other people who are thinking about VPPs, great opportunity for us to take that technology and try and export it around the world. I wish we did it quicker and better, with more support for everybody.
Any other debaters want to take that?
Yes, and yes. Let's start achieving that process of consensus and alignment on both sides of the table. Stuart was suggesting for software, and I would absolutely agree. But I'd also further suggest that with regards to hardware and the things that we're doing in installation standards and product standards, there's an opportunity, and we're doing it now.
Thanks, Lucy.
I think I'd just reiterate Lucy's point. It's not just hardware, software, it's the standards themselves, right? So through the international standardization framework that we have with ISO and IEC, it's an opportunity to share that IP, but once that goes into an international arena, that becomes a foundation and a framework for other economies to use and use as a basis. So we shouldn't just look at it in terms of that that supply or that back and forth between hard products themselves. It's actually the standards, and we see this not only across the electrotechnical space, but also in the areas of sustainability and things like asparagopsis in agriculture food, for example. These are sort of world-renowned standards that we're developing here in Australia and now putting on the global stage for consideration elsewhere. So just to be mindful that it goes beyond the hardware and the software that we see.
Thank you, Carlita. If there are no more answers from the panel on that first question, I'm happy to go to the second question from Ibrahim. Ibrahim, I believe the real challenge lies not in the standards themselves, but in their implementation. Standards can only drive real change if they're effectively adopted and applied in practice. Who is responsible, or who's the responsible to implement and uptake these standards across industries and utilities?
I might start with that, because this touches on one of the points that Ed spoke about right at the start, with regards to the fact that we are a federation of states, and it changes depending on what is being regulated. So if we look at electrical products, for example, they are regulated at a state level, and the standards are typically Australian, New Zealand, or ASNZS standards. And so the standard is common across Australia and New Zealand, but the way in which that standard is regulated can change from state to state. When it comes to installations, electrical installations, the same thing. When it comes to how one connects to the electrical grid, you have the DNSPs that have their own set of rules. Now, unfortunately, we've got, Ed, please correct me if I'm wrong, but at my last count, 16, 17 DNSPs around the country. It's in that order, and they all have quite significant differences in their approaches as well. And so we are doing a very good job at harmonising standards around Australia based on international experience. But where there is a really strong opportunity for us is to get greater alignment in the way those standards are regulated around Australia.
I'll follow up on Lucy. This is more a general policy and regulation point that is related to this debate. In my opening, I've talked about standards being probably, in the latter end of the whole process. The issue with implementation uptake has more to do about policy setting. We need to get the policy rationale. Why are we doing it? What outcome we're trying to achieve? Standards is perhaps the last thing that ties everything together. Once you've agreed on that, then, and including implementation, the standards is there to make sure that everyone is doing what the industry and you do it through a co-design process that all the stakeholders have agreed to do. The reason why we have this fragmentation now is we never spent enough time at the front end of the process where we agree this is what we need, this is who's going to do it, and then you tie everything up in the standards process. So my point is, for the industry as a whole, let's make sure we get that first part right, because if you get that first part right, you don't need to debate about who's uptaking it, who's implementing it.
I've probably come in with a slightly different and more sort of practical front-end approach to this. Often the standard, again, in this rapidly changing environment, often it's hard to get the standards really nailed down. So people who are on the sort of bleeding edge of implementing all the systems often have a lot of questions, and the key issue is everybody interprets the standard differently. That's happened, for decades in sort of tech innovation space. It's great. The role of standards is absolutely important. You want to nail all those things down. You want to clarify them so that everybody gets on the same page, both nationally and internationally. And you definitely need to get there. In practice, what tends to happen is that standards in their first incarnations tend to be incomplete and subject to interpretation. And often what can help there is doing things like we've done in Australia with C4NET, coming out with an implementation guide. So you have the formal standard, and then you get sitting alongside it some sort of informative document that tells you, when we're doing it here, this is how we're going to interpret. So everybody comes to a common agreement on this. Eventually, those informative things get either incorporated as informative parts of the standard, or get the standard gets more codified. The other thing that can be really helpful is open source reference implementations. So where you have some way of, if there's an open source way of doing stuff and everybody can access it, that tends to get everybody on the same page and doing the same thing, even if the standard might be subject to interpretation. So some of the, a lot of internet technology and other things have been driven by open source implementations that says, okay, the standard might be vague or might be interpretable in different ways, but here's a way that everybody is actually doing it in practice. And that can be helpful as well. So some of it, it's good to get the standards there, but sometimes in practice, you're going to be ahead of the standard, and you're still learning what good looks like and what everybody agrees on. So you need to take different approaches sometimes.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, you all. We've got a question from Wayne here, and also another similar one from Tim further down about, why can't we have the best of both worlds and span international standards and adapt to our needs without negating interoperability? And also a question around the definition problem of sovereign standard, and the key being actually adoption and modification, so it's fit for purpose. Is that something this panel would agree with?
I think that's probably where we've landed up, like any good debate. And I am when we're chatting about this debate just before, I remember somebody mentioned that they had bad flashbacks to debating in high school, and I remember such debates where people would spend half the debate debating the actual definition of a word, and it looks like sovereign is the word in this particular debate, is the one that people have many different definitions of what sovereign means. So I think, can we have it all? We're doing our best, actually. And you know what? In many cases, we are. You know, the work that the various people have been doing with regards to CCPOS with the adoption of IEEE 2030.5, you know, that's largely based on the Californian experience coupled with our work when it comes to products and installations where we're attempting to do exactly the same thing. But that underlines my earlier points about why we need to be deeply connected at that international stage. We need to be bouncing off each other locally and internationally wherever possible and as fast as possible to achieve the outcomes at the speed that we need to.
I'd probably just wholeheartedly support what Lucy has said. I think back to Wayne's question, can we have both? Well, absolutely. And are we set up to attempt to address that? Also, absolutely. Where we find that there's something that's happening in the international space and it may be 70, 80% of what we need, but then there may be slight nuances, well then, yes, we will come together with industry and say what needs to change to make this more appropriate for the Australian market. But that is based on experience, expertise, knowledge, and an element of consensus. And I think that's the core component. Is it's not a straight drag and drop here in Australia. There is an element of vetting that happens to make sure that it is appropriate. And I think that's the core essence of what we're trying to get to, is that not international or sovereign is better than the other, that there is a mechanism to try and test and say which works best here in Australia. And I think we do have those mechanisms built into our standards development process here, which I think we're quite proud of. Does it solve all of our problems? Does it mean that we get it first go? No. And I think to Stuart's point, things are moving so rapidly that sometimes we finish a standard and we know we've got to go straight into a revision because things have moved so quickly. So are there options to do interim standards, to do technical specifications, and then look at how we get it to an ASNZS? There are a lot of options, but again, it comes back to trying to work out what fits best for the Australian market.
I'd agree with that too. That I think that everybody who's involved in this space, that's what they're intending to do, is try and follow the international standards, contribute our bits, and agree and make it as consistent as possible. It's sometimes not possible to do that because even on the international stage, nobody knows what the right answer is. I noticed there's a comment about should we in one of the other questions about should we go IEEE 2030.5 or should we go Open ADR 3.0? You know, those, or should we go OCPP 2.1? You know, they're three different international options that all play in the same space. And show me the international expert who will give you the right ruling on which one's going to succeed. I know some of the people, and you know, everybody is in their own camp, and I don't know that who's going to be in a position to pick the winner on those three. We don't know, but I think everybody goes into this with the intention of doing exactly what Wayne's asking us to do, which is take the international experience, apply our expertise, and try and make it as consistent as possible wherever we can.
Thanks everyone for that. A bit of a change of topic for the next question from Anonymous. How do we drive stronger engagement of the small business innovators in standards so that standards drive national competitiveness and superior community outcomes?
Yeah, you go first.
I think that is done largely by the way we set up standards engagement in Australia. And so we have relevant technical committees that have a scope of work. Now, those technical committees are made up of not individuals, but individuals who are representing a nominating organisation. And the constitution of any given technical committee make sure that it does have broad representation based on those principles that I highlighted during the debate. And, you know, that will change from technical committee to technical committee. So you'll have people from regulators, from certifiers, from large industry, from small industry, from consumer reps. And that is probably the most effective way that I've seen to make sure that everybody gets a voice at that table.
I think just adding to Lucy's point, and also I think Stuart made this point earlier as well, there are going to be areas that are going to emerge where the pool of local experts is going to be quite small in the beginning, but it's the work of sort of my team and what George does as well in terms of going out and trying to set up those and build those relationships so that we can start tapping into some of that expertise. And do we work with burgeoning industry associations? Do we look at independent experts? Do we look at putting together project working groups to advise on either the development of a completely new standard or something in a different area? So there are more options becoming available to us in terms of trying to tap into expertise, but noting once it gets to a point where we are going to develop a standard, it heads into the land of what Lucy is talking about, where we pull together those technical experts around a table and make sure that we've got a balanced representation of views on that committee is pretty important.
Yeah, there is an opportunity for smaller players, particularly in that sort of de facto standards area. One of the good things, we talk about CCPOs and that we've talked about it a lot today. There's a technical working group that sort of is on the forefront of developing that standard. And the thing I really like about that group is it's very open. So almost anyone can join. It's a very collaborative group, and if you speak up, you get listened to. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about the way that we're doing that particular activity in Australia. It has to eventually get into a sort of standardisation and more formal stuff, and that's really important that everybody agrees. And there's a bit more argy-bargy once it gets to the Standards Australia's committees. But if we can be more open and sort of democratic and contributive in the early stages where those standards are still forming, that's a really good way to incorporate the smaller voices. And in the case of CCPOs, that's certainly the intention.
Thanks for that, Stuart. And I think that's a really great segue into the next question regarding how can we best help the standardisation process keep pace with the rapidly changing landscape this transitional period for energy? This is obvious around CER, where innovation is happening at a pace much closer to the technology sector than the traditional power sector. So how can standardisation processes keep pace?
For standardisation processes to keep pace, you've got to have technical experts around the table. Standardisation is a voluntary process. And so that means that the companies who are paying the way of the people sitting around that table need to be engaged with the process. So you've got to get them, you've got to get their buy-in. There is a case to be put that there is a role for governments, whether that be federal governments or state governments, to increase their level of investment at getting those people around the table, whether they be local tables or whether that be when we send our best and brightest minds around the world to engage. Unfortunately, to get people around the table has an expense attached to it. If we look at the outcomes and the fact that those outcomes are going to be shared by all Australians, I think you can mount that case that we need to make sure that all Australians indirectly footing the bill for that work.
I think Lucy makes an excellent point there, and one of the things that would be the expense of contributing to standards counts against smaller companies, for example, who might have some of the best innovative ideas. Getting government funding into those innovation companies and making it easy for them to both develop their product and also contribute to the standards work is really important. I don't know that we're quite doing that well enough in the sort of ICT space of the energy transition at the moment. We still get a lot of money going to sort of bigger established players, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe they don't get enough visibility of what's really happening, but I think we could encourage investment and encourage smaller companies, not just the big established players, or to be involved in the innovation, to get funded to do the work and to contribute those into the knowledge pool. Certainly in industries that are transforming quickly, in some of those other industries that I mentioned, the role of the innovative startups and getting them funded and going and supporting them has been absolutely crucial in making that change happen quickly.
Thanks, Stuart. Next one's from Tim Ryan, about the Australian government's data standards body. Seems to be a unique beast, focus on implementation, interoperability, dynamic development data, and is absolutely central. It's the body responsible for MyID and consumer data right. How do we move to expand it quickly? Might take that one on notice, actually. Move to another question on consumer engagement in standards development. So obviously the most important reason for consumer engagement is to deliver consumer benefits. How do we best ensure consumer? We've covered that. But it probably doesn't need to be covered. Next question is from Wayne. How difficult is it to ensure products coming here, such as EV chargers, do conform to our standards and are safe?
Yeah, I might tackle that one, and that speaks to the regulatory approach, which is the next step. So there's the writing of the standards, and different industries are regulated differently. In the world of electrical products, of which electric vehicle chargers are one of those, they fall under the state-based electrical safety legislation, and they're treated in the same category as, say, for example, your circuit breakers or your light switches or your socket outlets or your toasters or your kettles that everyone deals with. And what happens there is somebody who wants to bring such a product into Australia or manufacture in Australia, they must. There's different levels of regulation, and at the highest level, you must get that product tested by an independent accredited laboratory, and then you get that accredited test report, and then that goes to a third-party accredited certifier that's accredited by JASANS. They review all the documentation of the test report and the documentation that the manufacturer or importer provides to make sure that the product truly does meet all the requirements of the standard, and then they will issue what's known as a certificate of approval or a certificate of conformity. Some states have additional processes that are required. But fundamentally, you also need to make sure that product is marked, so that way the consumer has confidence that they can tie that product through to a particular certificate. It's a process that, by and large, works well. It could do with a lot of improvement, not to mention federal harmonisation, but it is a process that does deliver positive safety outcomes for Australians.
I think on for EV chargers, as a good example, there's almost two speeds of this. There's the stuff that Lucy was talking about, which is absolutely required to make sure it's safe and electrically safe and not a fire hazard and all that sort of stuff. And that process is pretty well worn. There's another level of how does that device connect into the grid at the sort of management level, and how do we manage the fleets of these devices, and how should they connect, and how should you control when they charge and discharge, and pricing for them, and all those sorts of things. ARENA's funded a group to look at CER integration to give advice on those sorts of things to people bringing CER into Australia, and to give them, without changing the policy or the standards or anything, just to give them guidance on what's the easiest path to get into to do this, what you have to do, which bits you have to comply with above that electrical and basic safety stuff, and that's important as well. So there's almost those, I think it's just two speeds. There's the absolute stuff that we need to make sure it's safe and secure, and then there's more dynamic, faster flowing, faster changing integration that has to happen as well.
Thanks, Stuart. There's a question from Dwight here around why aren't energy standards Australia-wide to save retraining when an electrician moves interstate? I can take that one very quickly. That actually we do develop all the standards Standards Australia develops are nationally harmonised standards, and I think as Lucy touched on earlier, different jurisdictions in Australia reference standards in different regulatory schemes. So that's probably why there's a perception that standards aren't Australia-wide. And I think there's that national harmonisation piece, which is something that I think the industry more broadly is crying out for. I'm not sure whether
and
any
further to that, if I may, George, the fact that you have that harmonisation at a standards perspective has now enabled advocacy efforts from organisations such as Master Electricians Australia and NECA to successfully advocate for a federal electrical licensing scheme. And that is something that is actively being worked on at the moment. So if that all goes to plan, in the not too distant future, we will likely be able to see a national register of electrical workers, which will enable them to move across borders.
Thank you, Lucy. And last question, we've only got time for one more. We're into the last 10 minutes of the debate. So there's a question from Susan around international standards and federation. So do we believe the international standards are a better way to overcome our federation problem, or are sovereign standards better? And I think that kind of sums up everything we've spoken about today. So I think that's maybe even an opportunity for all debaters to have one final message back to the audience before we wrap this up.
You go, Stuart.
You go. No, Ed, you first.
I think if we just set aside the debate as a framework to encourage this discussion, whether it's sovereign or whether it's international, the key in the Australian landscape is consistent national implementation and application. So I think, as Lucy has, a few others mentioned, you've got a nationally harmonised standard, but how it's reflected in state legislation, all of that, that's the next step. That's the crucial challenge, because standards on its own, even if everyone agrees in the industry, it doesn't have any effect unless often it's actually called up in state legislation, and this is where where the gap is.
Thanks.
May I respond to that? I think in the principles of consensus, this is where we have achieved alignment. What is most important is nationally consistent regulation of those standards, and that is something where we have an opportunity to improve as a nation to deliver outcomes that will deliver benefits for everybody.
And pragmatically, the the trades on the ground might disagree with me on this because they actually feel the pain of inconsistent application and adoption. But there are so many standards out there that govern so little things, and CER is going to make that landscape more challenging. Let's not worry about getting 100% consistency alignment. I think improvement is what I would like to see. So we aim towards the noble goal of everything consistent, but often the last 20% is the most costly, and we may just have to accept that so long as we have majority consistent application on the things that matter. That's what we need to work towards. Otherwise, we'll forever be debating and arguing.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the national standard, getting national sovereign standards is a good way is a practical approach. You can't wait for the international standards to deliver that to you. Lucy said it before, the way to get consistent standards is to get people, experts around a table talking about how it works. It's hard enough to do that in this industry between all the different, network operators that operate around Australia. Getting them to talk to each other and agree is a hard enough process in itself to deliver a national consistent standard. Doing that the international level is longer and harder and slower and won't deliver a result as quickly.
I think if I can round out what everyone has sort of said, I think sometimes we think that by producing a Australian standard, and by Australian I mean national, that we're going to solve the inconsistencies between the states. I think holding an Australian standard up as the panacea that's going to address all of that, I think would be quite naive. I think where the devil in the detail comes from is when you have a nationally consistent standard, how you harmonize across the states and make it applicable and its application consistent across the states, I think is the fundamental problem we all struggle with from whatever side we're coming from. And again, I think it's about what levers do we pull, and I think Ed brought this up rightly at the beginning of his opening, is it starts with those policy fundamentals. What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to do it? And how are we going to get everyone on board to do that? And I think sometimes we go, should it be carrot or stick? I don't know that we've necessarily worked that out, but I think there's a role for all of us to come together to try and make it as seamless as possible.
Thank you, everyone, for that. What we're going to do now is this is the big moment, the moment we find out the result of the debate. So we'll pose the same question we posed earlier, the debate question. Australia should define sovereign standards to shape its energy future. The poll should be live now, so please go to the poll and submit your answer. We'll give it just a little bit of time. I should have come prepared with some music to counter the awkward silence. Oh, okay, so much closer. Agree wins the debate by a margin of 57 to 43. I guess well done to Carlita and Lucy being the negative. You did work some people back to your side.
Tell you what, to take 20% off, I'll take that as a win.
It is yeah. Maybe this is one of the few debates everyone wins. But no, thank you to our 4 debaters, Ed, Carlita, Stuart, and Lucy. Thank you for your efforts today, and thank you for making this a wonderful and very thought-provoking debate. So with that, I think I'll hand over to the Australia 4 team to wrap the event up. Or maybe not. No. The event, the next debate will be next Friday, the 7th of November. Australia can only address the skills gap through industry-based training. That'll be moderated by Jamie Burridge at Engineers Australia. Same time as the debate this week, 12:30 to 2 o'clock. Please join us for that. I'll be on now. I've done the moderating, but keen to be a attendee and put my questions in next week. Thank you all for your attendance, and wishing you a good afternoon.
Thanks very much for that,
Thanks,
George. Sorry, we had a little hiccup just at the end. Ian's a little bit out of touch as you're driving along. So yes, as George said, please join us again next week. There's a QR code there you can use to register for the rest of the series of debates. And in the coming weeks, we'll be putting up all of the recordings for everybody to be able to see what's going on. And we'll be bringing out the results as a consolidated report. Thank you all very much. Thank you again to everybody who's participated today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jordan.